Hey guys, here we have our notes on natural selection, which is probably one of my favorite things to teach. You've got a picture here of Darwin, of Charles Darwin, when he was young and one when he was older. So way back in the day, in the 1800s, Darwin was asked by one of his friends if he wanted to come on this expedition. Back then, when they wanted to map land or continents, they actually had to go out there on a ship. And so that's what Darwin did. The captain asked him if he wanted to come along to basically be the naturalist that was on board. So it was Darwin's job to basically draw pictures, right? Not take pictures, but draw pictures of all the stuff that they saw and collect specimens of plants and animals and bring them back to England to show people what it looked like out there and in basically South America, but mostly the Galapagos Islands. So here's basically a map of what they did. And this was a British Navy mapping expedition on the HMS Beagle. And they kind of hopped around to a lot of different places and got to explore a little bit and see what the land was like. But there was one particular place where Darwin got his inspiration, and that was the Galapagos Islands. So here he noticed that there were these birds called finches, and there were little differences between the finches, which was really convenient because they did not have to compete with each other. So when he looked at the finches a little bit closer, he noticed that the beaks that they had that were a little bit different were especially suited for whatever it was that they were eating. Some of them had really skinny beaks and some of them had really thick, strong beaks, and they ate different kinds of food. Some of them ate insects and they were really good at probing. Some of them were really good at stabbing the insects. Some of them could even use tools to kind of catch insects. And some of them had these really strong crushing bills that were really great for crushing seeds and eating seeds. And the reason this was so awesome was because they didn't have to compete with each other for the same food. So they all had different food that they were eating, and they were all able to coexist on these islands and not have to fight over any of the resources there. And that's when Darwin got his idea of natural selection. And he started saying, hey, you know, at one point, these finches were all just one species, but because they don't want to compete with each other, because then some of them will end up dying, they started to specialize in eating different kinds of food, and different traits helped them do that. So that's what natural selection is. Natural selection is basically there's certain traits that that nature is selecting for. There are these desirable traits that help the organism survive. And if the organism does not have desirable traits, then they're not going to last very long, and they're probably going to die because they're not able to escape predators or find food as easily. And so since they die early, they're not able to pass down their genes. They're basically going to die, and those genes aren't going to get a chance to end up in the offspring, and the ones that do end up in the offspring are going to be the good genes. So really quickly, niche, if you imagine a puzzle, an ecosystem being kind of like a puzzle, and all of the organisms in it have a role to play. They have a job to do. You know, they have a certain place that they live or a certain way that they live, if they create burrows or make nests, what kind of food they eat, how they catch their food, everything that makes up that organism, all of its what it does and its traits make its niche. That's where it fits into the ecosystem. You can't take one organism and try to make it fit into a different niche, right? Just like you can't take a puzzle piece and try to make it fit into a different spot in the puzzle. So that's what a niche is. It's the position or the function of an organism in a community. Is it, you know, what type of consumer is it? Is it a producer? That sort of thing. That's its niche. And so natural selection is when nature selects certain animals with stronger traits to survive and reproduce. Those organisms with the stronger desirable traits are going to be the ones that live, and so they're the ones that have babies, and they're the ones that get to pass on their genes. The other guys don't. And so they have these adaptations or characteristics that help them survive, right? It increases their ability to survive in the environment, and then they're able to reproduce. So that's the whole thing about natural selection. They have these desirable traits, these adaptations that make it possible for them to live longer and to pass down those genes. So let's look at an example. The peppered moth is a really good example of when humans affected natural selection. This was back during the Industrial Revolution when we went from everybody pretty much growing their own food and making their own clothes to people buying stuff and factories being built and cars started to get used, and there was all this pollution in the air that covered these trees and changed the color of the trees. Previously, the trees had been kind of like this grayish whitish color, and the peppered moth could blend into it. So there were two versions of the peppered moth, just like how some of us have dark hair and light hair. There was the dark peppered moth, which there weren't very many of them, but then there was the light colored moth that was the one that had the desirable traits, the adaptation for camouflage, and so that was the one that was surviving more and passing on its genes more because it was able to hide from birds or predators that were coming by and eating the moths. But then all this pollution ended up in the air. This was before we had laws about pollution, and the white one started to stick out on these trees that were covered in soot. And the black one was the one that now had the desirable trait. And because our organisms cannot adapt fast enough to basically things that humans are changing about the environment, the peppered moth went extinct. And so there's lots of other examples that are like this. For example, the polar bear is really hurting right now because of climate change and the ice caps melting. They're losing habitat, and they're not able to adapt fast enough. So in this case, this isn't really natural selection because we're the ones that are changing the environment, and that's making it impossible for these organisms to survive because they are not able to adapt fast enough. So again, let me review how natural selection works. We have a population with different traits. For example, we can have a population of frogs that have different lengths of tongue. You know, some of them have short tongues and some of them have long tongues. And the ecosystem reaches what's called a carrying capacity. I think of like a basket, and only a certain amount of stuff can fit in the basket. Ecosystems are like that. There's only a certain amount of resources that an ecosystem can have for a certain population. In other words, it can only support a certain number of organisms. Anything over that, they're not going to survive. They're not going to get enough food, or they're not going to have enough habitat. And then the individuals with stronger traits, because there's too many of them, the ones with the stronger traits are the ones that are going to be able to survive. They're the ones that are going to be able to find a place to live, you know, have a home. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to find food or escape predators, and the ones that don't have those desirable traits or those adaptations will not survive, and so they will not be able to pass on their genes. The ones that do pass on their genes, they are the ones that live longer, so they have more babies, and after a while, we're talking hundreds of thousands to millions of years, we actually have the development of a new species, which is what the name of Darwin's book was. It was called The Origin of Species. And so that's when we have kind of a branch in the family tree where a new species is actually born. So a really good example that I always give my students is what if the cafeteria decided to only serve 100 plates every day? We have 500 and a little bit more than 500 seventh graders at Memorial. So what if they said, you know what, we're only going to serve 100, y'all are on your own. So the students that have certain adaptations are going to be the ones that are able to get that food. They're the ones that are going to be able to run really fast, or they're very sneaky and they can cut in line, or even, you know, where they're at, like their classroom is closer to the cafeteria, so they're going to be able to get to the cafeteria faster. Those are the ones that are going to be able to get food. Well, what about the other guys? You know, what kind of stuff can they do in order to continue to survive? Well, maybe the ones that have really good memory are going to remember to bring a lunch from home, or they'll remember to bring money to be able to buy stuff from the snack bar. What about if the principal says, okay, well, we're going to have an open campus and people are going to be able to leave. So those people that also remember to bring money to be able to go to churches or McDonald's or the gas station, they will be able to get food also. The ones that are good time managers because they can go and come back in 30 minutes, those guys are going to be the ones that are able to get food. So those are the ones with those desirable traits that will survive longer, and they'll be able to get food in that type of environment. So that's basically how natural selection works. And after a while, this leads to different species, right? We have these traits that are being selected for that create a brand new species. Selective breeding is when people, humans, decide what the desirable traits are. So now it's not natural selection, it's actually also called artificial selection. So a really good example of this is with dogs. We say, oh, that dog is so cute. I want to have puppies that are just as cute as that dog, so I'm going to pick another dog, a male and a female dog that have these traits that I like long ears or the rounded face or short legs, and I'm going to breed them so that their offspring look the same. And so we do this over hundreds of thousands of years. We drastically change the way that these organisms look. So these two pictures here, the black and white one is from 100 years ago, and then the colored one is from a modern day example of the same breed of dog. And you can see how they've changed over 100 years. This doesn't just happen with dogs. We do it with farm animals, cows. Well, we want the cows that produce the most milk, or we want the ones that make the best steaks. Or with plants, we want the juiciest fruit and the better tasting corn and that sort of thing. So we say, you know what, this plant tasted way better than that plant. Let's use the seeds from this guy here and plant those seeds so that we have, the better tasting corn next year and that sort of thing. And so after we do that for so long, we actually change the actual organism, and that's selective breeding or artificial selection. And I'll show you a video that gives really good examples of how food especially has changed over time. This is a really funny cartoon. The wolf says, humans at a campfire, it's cold and I'm starving. Maybe I should ask for some scraps. What's the worst that could happen? And then 10,000 years later, we have birthday parties for our pugs. So let's talk about the different types of adaptations. The first one is structural. You have a picture of a moose on the front of your notes for this one. So this is the easiest type of adaptation to see because it's right there in front of you, and you can see that the moose has long legs, or that something has sharp teeth, or it's got different colored fur, or things like that. And it's just the shape or the body parts of the animal that help it do something, like wings will help it fly, or that sort of thing. Behavioral is how an organism acts. So migration, different birds do mating dances to attract a mate. Polar bears will hibernate to keep out of the coldest winter months. And it's just what organisms do. A really good example is the killdeer, which is a bird that pretends that its wing is broken so that it could lure a predator away from its nest. And then when it feels like the predator is far enough away from its nest, it flies away. And so those are behavioral things. It's just what the organism does. And then the hardest one to see is going to be internal, which is a physiological adaptation. This is happening inside the organism's body. For example, a snake's venom is something that it produces inside of its body. A skunk's spraying, that's something that it creates inside of it, which is actually urine. Pheromones, the animals will smell different ways to attract mates and things like that. That's something that's happening inside of their body. It's not structural, so it's not as obvious, but it is an adaptation. So let's talk a little bit about how we know that this is happening. How do we know, what's the evidence out there that evolution is real, that it's actually going on? So the first one is embryology and DNA comparison. So if you see the picture on the left here, when we look at embryos, in other words, even a human, this is an example of a human, there's stages as an embryo where we have things that are kind of left over from our ancestors, like a tail, that eventually disappears as we develop, and we don't have that anymore. There's also vestigial structures that we have, like our appendix and our wisdom teeth, that we don't need anymore, but they're throwbacks to what we used to be in the past when we had a much larger skull that could actually fit our wisdom teeth and that sort of thing. And then we have DNA. We can actually compare our DNA to other organisms and see how similar it is. So here's what we need to fill in for our embryology and our DNA comparison. So let me show you a picture of DNA. So the arrows are a little off, sorry about that. But if we look at these two bits of DNA, we have where they actually line up, and they're very similar to each other. If we had organisms that were even more similar to each other, then they would have more DNA in common. It's not going to be 100% the same unless it's the same individual or they're identical twins, but there are commonalities between different species. So we know that they're related and that they basically had a common ancestor in the past. Fossils. If we look at fossils, we can see transitions between different species and basically how one species became another species. So I'm going to show you a picture of that. Here on the left, we have kind of this organism that was sort of like a hippo that basically evolved into our modern day whale. And this is what I'm talking about with these vestigial structures. You can see how at the bottom that we've got an organism with legs, and then as we go up in time, like later in time, it disappears, and we have these leftover clues as to what they used to be in the past. And so this is a timeline of how the organism evolved. On the right-hand side, you have the Eohippus at the bottom, which is a horse 60 million years ago, and then how it evolved, how it got bigger over time and evolved into our modern day horse that we have nowadays. And so you can imagine, well, being bigger is definitely going to be a desirable trait. And so the bigger Eohippuses, they survived longer and were able to pass on those traits for size. And over time, they just got bigger and bigger and bigger to what we have today. So we can see that in the fossil record, how something used to be, its ancestors used to be different, and how it evolved over time. And then if we look at our anatomy, I mentioned vestigial structures and things like that, but basically we have homologous structures and analogous structures. So a homologous structure is when two organisms have share a trait that they have gotten from a common ancestor. In other words, they were both related to each other. And then we have analogous structures, are similar traits that are found in species that they are not closely related. But because they have similar niches, they play the same role, they have these similar structures. So let's look at some examples of those. So here, if you look at the colors, they're color coded. Humans, cats, whales, bats, we all have fingers. And we all have, the same two arm bones and wrist bones and things like that. And so we can see that there's something going on here where we are related to each other because we have such similarities between us. So here is a little comparison between natural selection and artificial selection, and it's basically a Venn diagram. So they're both ways that organisms change from generation to generation, and they are required. There's diversity between them. In other words, there's different traits between them. The main thing is that with natural selection, nature is going to be selecting these traits, and it happens slowly over time. Artificial selection is going to happen a lot faster because humans are deciding what those desirable traits are. The thing with artificial selection is that it's not always good for the organism, especially with dogs. Sometimes these traits that we like are actually going to decrease an organism's fitness. For example, some dogs will have breathing problems because their faces are kind of squished, or they'll have joint problems because their legs are really short. And so it's not going to be good for that breed of dog because we're not really breeding it for fitness. But in natural selection, they're being bred for fitness in order to survive in the environment a little bit better. Here's that same Venn diagram, just a little bit up close. And so this is a really good way to end our natural selection presentation. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you in class. Thanks for watching.